Welcome everyone to our event. This event is brought to you by Datadog's Club, which is a community of people who love data. We have amazing events, and this event is one of such events. To find about our events, other events, you can go to the description. There is a link in the description with our events. You can just click on this link and you'll see that we have a lot of amazing events. So we have two types of events. Today we have a webinar with a presentation, and then on Fridays we typically have interviews. We call them live podcasts, so do check it out. And there is a link to our Google Calendar. You can just subscribe to the calendar and you will be notified about all our events. Then subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with all our new videos. And finally, join our Slack to talk about different data topics. During the talk today, you can ask any question you want. So there is a link pinned in the description. Just click on this link and ask any question you want, and we will be covering questions at the end of the presentation. And then finally, I know that many people are watching this in recording, especially today we have our event at a different time. If you watch this event in recording and if you want to ask a question, you can go to our Slack. There is an event Q&A channel, and you can just ask your question there. And with that, my introduction is over. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alexei. So now I'm going to, hi everyone. Yep. Hope you guys have a very nice afternoon, evening, or morning there. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to present my screen, and hopefully you guys can take a look into it. Okay, so. Okay, I hope I'm sharing my screen properly here, right? So I'm going to present to you about unboxing design docs for data scientists, right? Before I move on into like to the core of these presentations, to this webinar, I would like to introduce a little bit of myself. Like, you guys might be wondering, like, who am I? So yeah, this is me. So my name is Vincent, and I'm a machine learning engineer / analyst at Trust and Safety Google, right? So if you guys, if you want to find out more about me, I have a Medium, LinkedIn, and Data Podcast articles for you to take a look into. So just a bit of disclaimer, so to make sure that I don't get fired tomorrow, no, just kidding, is that is that this presentation belongs to me, right? So this is based on my own ideas, my own research, on based on my own experience, right? So so this is not based on my company or not based on like other agendas outside my own personal sharing. Okay. So this is what I'm working on, and currently my work is to prevent phishing at scale with data analytics and machine learning. And for today's agenda, we have like around like 1 hour for this webinar. Like the first one I want to talk about is why design docs, right? Why design docs are very important. How do we unbox it? What's documentation? What's the things about design docs that we always hear of, right? Whenever we talk about like the big companies, especially like Google, right? And the second thing is how to build design docs. So I'll do a little bit of demo and to showcase about what a design docs look like and what design docs consist of. And the third one is the what, right? What are the types of design docs? So I will start with why, how, and what about design docs. And hopefully by the end of these presentations, you have a little bit of ideas about what design docs is. And of course, you can start writing on it, and it could boost your machine learning and data analytics projects in a more effective and efficient way. Okay. Okay, but of course, in case that you want to find out what's the TLDR, right? I just want to visit this presentation for like 5 minutes. It's really up to you. So the TLDR, too long didn't read, is that design docs as a conceptual lighthouse. Build design docs, I'm going to introduce these are the structures, objective, MVP, research milestone, and TLDR. And types of design docs, I'm going to talk about the space of design docs according to my own experience, right? That there are architecture, implementations, and idea spaces. So if you find that you already know a bunch about these projects, feel free to like ask more questions, or maybe like share with me your knowledge. But for the rest of presentations, these are basically the golden nuggets of what I'm going to present. Okay, so why design dots, right? And of course, the answer is there as a conceptual lighthouse. And what do I mean by that, right? So I do have a Medium article, so feel free to take a look into it if you like to know more and to actually maybe like if you forget about what I'm going to say. So the Medium article is there. But the best answers to this is to answer this question, right? How do I make sure my data project is successful, right? How do I communicate and realize impact for my stakeholders? So if you are like me, that we always need to start somewhere, right? Like we always have the baby steps in data science projects. This is an experience that I have, right? As a noob mistake, right? And maybe you experience it as well, or maybe you are a unicorn from the start, right? We don't know. But if you are not a unicorn from the start, then I think you might encounter some parts of this, right? So this happened to me when I started working, right? It might be lengthy, but I just jump to the highlighted parts, right? That's why those are the highlighted parts. So I just received a new project, right? Data analytics project. And the first thing that I'll do, right, especially after you're going out to the from university, right, is that I look into Kaggle, right? I look into Kaggle, I look into GitHub, I jump into the code that sort of like have the similar implementations. And the hope is that hoping I could resolve the project quickly, right? But then this is where the pain point starts, is that I introduced many bugs, right? Open source packages were broken, there's outages, breakdowns, there are repeats of experiments because I never documented everything, right? And because of that, I repeated things. I spent weeks to just create a model, right? That is actually subpar in terms of performance, right? And once I was done, I realized that, hey, the model was too complex and obtuse. Like the engineering team doesn't really understand what I'm building, right? Where I'm performing wrong. Apparently, I have too many false positives to be reliable, right? And apparently, they want a simple model, right? They want an interpretability compared to complexity, right? So of course, I needed to spend all-nighters and implement a simple model that actually did enough for the team, at least for everyone to understand and jump into the model why there are misclassifications, right? So this is from my experience, and to summarize this, I can summarize it into like three concepts. So the first one is lack of planning, right? I didn't plan at all whenever I jump into the project. And the second one is that untracked experiments, right? I just try to hack around, build architecture, do parameter tuning, maybe like makes the number of layers like more varied, right? But it does no wonder because I never really document it. So I keep repeating the same mistakes all over again. And the third one is definitely mismatch expectations, right? So what I have in mind, especially out of school, is that something that's very complex, right? In the school, we never really learn about like looking at data first, but we always learn about deep learning and machine models. So because I didn't really like start from the basic, right? That happens, the mismatch expectation happens, right? And basically what I'm providing is not for the sake of solving problem, but for the sake of doing what I want to do, right? So this is my noob mistake. And if you think that this is part of you, well, then you are not alone, right? In fact, there is this a very famous story about Netflix $1 million signing stone, right? So in this case, Netflix never used its 1 million algorithm due to engineering costs. So some of you might know about this, maybe most of you, because it's a very huge story at the point of time, is that in 2009, Netflix released a competition, right? And the first winner of that competition can improve 10% of the RMSE, or the recommendation system model, right, accuracy. And in the face value is very huge, right? But by the end of the day, because it's too costly to implement, they just put it at the corner. It's like you're buying fitness equipments. They're very, very expensive, but just to leave it in the garage. after like 1 month. I mean, I experienced that. Yeah. So that happened because of the mismatched expectations. So in other words, to summarize, the pain points that we are trying to solve here is that we need a way to navigate business, data, and engineering complexity, right? While writing clear documentations and managing stakeholders' expectations. And I cannot really emphasize enough that this is actually would determine whether your data projects will be successful or not. Okay. So this is a type of design docs. I'm going to present to you about it soon. So these are very simple design docs that doesn't include like machine models, but it's basically just accessing Facebook API for Instagram business. Okay. But before we move on to the demo and what we need to put in the design docs, but let me try to explain why design docs are really important first, right? So design docs, just as like what you saw just now, is very important because it is meant to be a lighthouse, right? And a lighthouse, imagine that a lighthouse in the middle of like peninsula somewhere, right? Imagine that a lighthouse that stands there. What's the purpose, right? The purpose is to make sure that it signals a certain goal or destination, so that every embarking boat, especially in the middle of the dark, in the middle of night, they can use the lighthouse to navigate themselves in the dark, right? And even though, let's say, there's a turbulent wave that come in, right? With the lighthouse, every boat captain can always steer back to the destinations and reach into their destinations safely, right? So this is the analogy of the design docs, right? And what do I mean by that exactly? Is that let's try to remove and replace some of the words into some of the terms that we know of, right? So for example, like dark is unrealized data project, the boat is you, and the lighthouse is design docs. So what this means is that whenever that we work on a certain data project in a data team, right, in a real life setting, usually what we want to achieve are very ambiguous, right? So if you go to a certain experiment, let's say I want to experiment with a certain feature engineering, or even I have a very big bet, right? I want to experiment with migrating a certain model into a different structured models, right? For example, graph neural network from a linear model, for example, is a huge change. So we have like multiple projects here and there, right? And we might have like more ideas to improve the accuracy, or we want to deliver more impacts to our stakeholders, right? But then it's all in the dark, right? We don't know like which one that we focus on. We don't know which one that we should prioritize. We don't know what that we should dig deeper into, right, to deliver impacts. So unrealized data projects is like the darkness itself. And we, as a data scientist or data practitioners, we always find ourselves in the dark, right, with unclear requirements and unclear expectations. So you, as the boat, need to find the lighthouse, right? So the lighthouse here would be the design docs, right? So for me, since I work in a project with many different data science projects, which sometimes are realized and sometimes are not, right? Sometimes I dig into a certain project, let's say for feature engineering, and by the end of like, let's say 1 month or 2 months, I realize that I need to work on something else, right? Because it's very dynamic environment there, or because the timing is just not right. Maybe that I don't have manpower or not. So rather than just scrap this data project, usually what I do is that I will come back to it later, right? And maybe like 1 year in the future, right? Who knows? So design docs help me to just jump on that straight, right? Okay, this is where the progress, these are the documentations that all that I have, right? And this is me experimenting to myself like 1 year in the future, what this project is all about and how we should achieve it, right? So that's how design docs work as a lighthouse. Okay. And the second thing is that design docs deliver shared impacts, right? Design docs are highly used in engineering focused culture like Google and Amazon. In fact, you will find a lot of resources about design docs. But of course, there's no like one way to settle one structure for all problems, no, because different problems will have like different focuses, right? But by the end of the day, the idea is that how can we make sure that people can collaborate together? and they can understand what you're working on and they can jump on it, right? So they are meant to share ideas, progress, and results to highlight shared goals and impacts, right? So for example, if you're working on a machine learning model, right? Let's say a neural network model, right? And your implementation is actually transferable to other teams, right? So usually the other teams, they know that I'm presenting this, they know that I have this design docs. They will look into it, right? And then see how much applicable it is to the use cases, right? And they will reach out to me. And then they will say, hey, Vincent, can we collaborate on this together, right? So design docs is really, really important to share knowledge and deliver shared impacts. Okay. So this is like one-liner to show what design docs is and why we need to have design docs. So design docs form conceptual lighthouses to understand how you navigate short-sightedness, eliminate time sinks, and deliver shared impacts. So how to build design docs, right? What are kind of structures that usually practitioners have for design docs? So of course, this is the point where every practitioner might have like different understanding about what design docs is about. But to me, I would like to categorize it into like a few questions that you really need to answer whenever you go through a certain data project, right? And these are a little bit of structures that I think is generalizable for most practitioners. So the first one is objective, right? By the end of the day, you need to ask like why you're building this, right? What's the intent in mind? The second is deliverable, right? So minimum viable product, what's important for your audience? The third one is research and explorations. What time and resources are available? The fourth one is milestones and results. So this is where the documentations part, especially to your experiments, come in, right? What can and has been achieved, right? So this is the difference of milestone and results, right? Milestone is like, what's the plan, right? What I want to achieve next month or next quarter, right? But results is like whatever I already have done in the past, right? So what I have achieved past 1 month or past quarter. So that's the difference of milestone and results, whether it's realized or not. And we have TLDR, right? What's the summary? What's the golden nuggets for all of this, right? So that if your manager comes in and want to find out, Vincent gave me a highlight. Okay, this is the TLDR, maybe a 3-liners, 4-liners. This is what you need to have to know about my documents. Feel free to invest yourself more time if you want to read more, right? So that's the idea. Okay, so let me demo a sample so this is, obviously I cannot share with you about my Google related design docs because it's definitely confidential, but I would like to share with you about non-profit organizations that I'm helping out, which is called Yayasan Majid Hati, YMH. So this is definitely not in English. So this is in Indonesian, actually, Bahasa. So as what you know, like the pandemic in Indonesia is really bad. It's actually the epicentrum right now. And as an Indonesian, I also would like to help Indonesians, like practitioners, maybe like Indonesian students and youth. So basically, Yayasan Majid Hati is a non-profit organization to raise mental health awareness for Indonesian youth, right? So this is the sort of non-profit organization that I'm helping out. And the design docs that I'm creating for them is that how can they analyze whether their Instagram efforts is bringing into fruition or not, like what kind of marketing campaigns are successful, what kinds of metrics that they should use. So this is the first time I know the difference of impression and reach, right? Before this, I didn't even know what's the difference of impression and reach, but now I know, right? Impression is like what you see, and reach is basically what you are invested in. Maybe like can be put in like as a click, right? So this is a design doc that I created for them. So let me try to go through a little bit about this. So at the very first beginning, you will find the title, right? And you will find the metadata, right? So the metadata can include, like, for example, the bugs, the other contributors, or the deliverables. It's really up to you, right? It's just like additional effort to make sure that other people know like who's contributing for this. And the very first beginning that you see is the objective, right? So in this case, to extract high quality Instagram data, right, exclusive to YMH marketing needs. So the idea for the objective here, it should be one-liner. It should be very short. It shouldn't be like 5 sentences in one paragraph or so on. It should be a very short, simple, okay, this is what I want to do, right? I want to extract high quality Instagram data or insights. And these are the TLDR, right? So the TLDR is that this explains to you that we have expand the objective, identify important credentials, identify triggers, run refresh, and whatsoever, right? Notice that the objective and TLDR will be different, right? Depending on your audience, right? If your audience, obviously in this case, the audience are technical, right? That's why I talk about like the triggers, run refresh, the important credentials and keys and whatever, right? But if your audience is business, obviously you need to talk more about the metrics that the business need to have, right? For example, impressions and reach, right? Just put it there in the TLDR, 25% impression and reach improvement, right? So this will be different depending on your audience. The third one is a minimum viable product, right? So by the end of the day, what you want to focus on, right? So how do you determine success criteria? Is there the metrics? And basically, I created a dashboard for them. So I put a screenshot there, right? And also I put like, okay, so these are the example business focus and metrics that we need to find out. And these are basically the criteria of the success. Okay. And after that, research and explorations. So this research and explorations is a bit too short because this is for a very simple kind of like implementation. But the research can be more on the like the tools that you have, or maybe it could be more on the EDA that you have, or maybe like different kinds of like past and existing collaborations or existing design docs, right, for a certain project that could give the context, right? So whatever research and explorations. So the idea here is that if a certain exploration fails, you can always like move on to certain exploration, other explorations, right? And you can always ask for example, your stakeholders' approval, whether like, is it correct for me to use Google Data Studio over Tableau, for example? So this really helps for you to understand how you should get from point A to point B, right? And afterwards, there's a milestones and results, right? So for example, I put data architecture illustrations there. There's a dashboard illustrations, the triggers and links. So of course, all of these are results, right? Because I already implemented it. But beforehand, this should be a milestone, like for example, on certain date, what you plan to achieve, is it done or not, right? So you can be even more ambitious than this, right? So you can see that all of these are. I even have a GIF file, right? So the end results, right? So these are the kind of ideas that I'm trying to achieve with Instagram and AppScript, right? Very simple MVP, but it reach out it helps me to achieve the results that I want. Okay. So this is open for public, yeah. But I strip critical links. So feel free to look into like Medium articles, or maybe like you can take a look at my slides, which I think will be shared here. Okay, so let's move on to the presentation. Okay. Yeah, so the very first thing that we talk about is objective, right? So if you take a look here, like there are companies and the sentences here about like what vision and mission it is. So Google is like organize the world's information. Facebook gives people the power to build, and Airbnb is like there, right? So you notice that the shorter it is, the more powerful it is, right? So for objective, the highlight, right, if you want to make a simple objective and the successful objective, is that you just want to make it short, right? Or KISS, right? KISS, keep it simple and short. So in other words, for example, here in the demo, I say to extract high quality Instagram data, right? Or to increase FN coverage with graph network. It's really up to you, depending on your use case. Tips is that you can also use it for your personal objective. So I do have design docs for myself, right? to like, I call it the Vincent project whatsoever. But yeah, that's also another way. The second one is that too long didn't read. So what's the tips there? The tips is that it needs to be saving your stakeholders' time, right? As simple as that. If it doesn't save your stakeholder times, there's no use to have like the golden nuggets of TLDR, right? So usually you should put it on the top. That's why I put it next to the objective. You shouldn't put it at the bottom, right? So by the end of the day, it's like a synopsis in research. It should give your stakeholders an idea whether I should put more investment to it or not. MVP. So MVP is your North Star, basically. It should determine the metrics. It should determine the criteria on what you should have, right, in order to know that your project is successful or not. Right? It's like you have a compass, right? So you always need to look into the compass to reach your destinations, right? Hence the North Star. So a little bit of guide of MVP is that it should be realistic than idealistic, right? An MVP should be like solve at the low hanging fruits, right? That's why it's called minimum, not maximum, right? And the second one is that it should be conservative than ambitious, right? It should be metrics focused and it should be iterative, right? So for example, a certain document for a certain MVP, right? It can always expand to something else, right? For example, you're researching on the potential of using graph network or social network studies, right? Then you can start with just, okay, I just want to use like one feature and I create a graph. If it's very successful, then you might want to append more features, right, inside the graph network, right? And then you keep appending on it, and you will try to shift the minimum viable products for each design docs, right? So you have like multiple iterative design docs. And that's how it really works in Google, right? And the third one is research and explorations. So again, what tools you are going to use for machine learning project? It could be your EDA, exploratory data analysis, why is this important, what models you should build, whatsoever. Right. Milestones and results. So as what I've mentioned to you, it should be a short-term dynamic goals. Milestones will become results once you achieve it. Oh, sorry. And once you accomplish the milestones, you should document the results, right? For example, I generated insights to increase X% viewer reach. So this is a recap, right? So the recap is that we learned about the structures, objective, minimum viable products, research explorations, milestone results, and TLDR, too long didn't read. Bear in mind that it will differ for different use cases, right? Obviously, for the use cases that means that users like machine models will have a lot more others like classification criteria, right? For example, like you need to make sure that there's a precision involved, there's a recall precisions, or maybe like confidence metrics, AOC, ROC. So all of those like machine learning related evaluations, it might be very different in terms of interpretations in the technical design docs compared to the business design docs, right? So obviously, when you talk to business-related design docs, you don't talk about like ROC, AOC, but you talk about more on how much revenue that is getting, right? So different design docs will be different for different audience. Okay. So the last one that I want to mention after we talk about why and how design docs is I want to talk about what the principles of design docs exactly, or what kinds of varieties of design docs. And I do have another Medium article for this that talks about it in greater detail. Right? But in the first thing that you want to answer is that who is your audience? Right? So your audience, the very first one is yourself, right? You will be your very first audience. The second one will be your team members, your colleagues, right? The third one will be your executives, which means a manager or maybe your higher ups, right? They want to understand, for example, how your work will translate to the higher level OKR, objective key results, or the objective of the larger umbrella team. And the fourth audience will be the cross department, right? Maybe it's from other teams that want to implement your solutions in the use case, right? And finally, the fifth one is external, which is what I'm currently doing with you guys as well, right? I'm presenting to the external team. And so the kind of information that you can deliver to the external team will be very different from the information that you can deliver in your internal team, right? So you need to answer this first, right? Who are your audiences? Okay. And these are a little bit of like diagrams that I've created, right? Especially for the design docs types for the right space and implementations. And what do I mean by space here? Space in terms of the platforms, in terms of audience that comes into that space, and in terms of like the purpose and time investment, right? So at the lower level beginning, you will see the idea space. So this is filled with one pager or simple documents, right? And then the middle one is the implementation space. So this talks about the system design blocks. So the idea here is that, let's say the one pager will be like a certain POC approach, right? Proof of concepts. So you want to explain, for example, how a certain feature can improve a certain model, right? So you put it as an experiment, one pager, idea space. You have an idea and you want to prove it, right? If let's say that is correct, right? It's performing really well, then the idea next is to bring it up to the implementation space. So how does it build the system overall, right? So let's say you have a system of recommendation service, right? And you discovered that your idea that is successful is that you want to introduce a certain feature. Let's say that you want to introduce, let's say a fashion recommendation system. You want to introduce the user's fashion style, for example, or fashion preference, right? So after that, you push it up to the system design doc, and then you will implement it, right? You will add on a certain feature. Okay, this is an extra additional feature, and this is how it works in the model overall, right? And afterwards, if it's really successful, then you want to think about in a larger space, right? Which is the architectural design doc, right? So architectural design docs is usually very, very linked to the North Star, right? So let's say for me it's phishing, right? So the North Star is very simple, right? The North Star is that how can we reduce phishing, right? We have like multiple metrics to show that. And if let's say that you already have like multiple systems, right, inside this classifications, then what you want to do is that how this feature, right, will translate to the, let's say, the downstream and upstream applications, right? Because it's very rare to see that a system that works by itself. Usually you will have a system that works in a network of systems, right? So that is what the architectural design doc trying to show, right? To how a certain improvement or a certain system are actually related to each other. So there are some spaces that we see here: experimental space, launch space, and stable space, right? And this by Harvey Diamond. If you don't know what you want to achieve in your presentation, your audience never will, right? So design docs meant to understand first what your audience is, and then deliver to what that audience really care of. Right? So these are a little bit of, like, for example, highlights about what each of the space really represents and how you should cater your design docs based on the space. Right? So for example here, the audience, right? You see that the audience for stable launch experiment is very different, right? So for example, the launch, you need to talk to the tech leads. You need their approvals. You need to have a cross departments, especially for up and downstream applications. For architecture, then you talk about to the executives, right? To your higher ups to make sure that you don't screw up, right? Because it's a very huge impact. And of course, there's also time investment, right? Usually, the higher up the space there, the more time investment that you need, right? So idea space is very dynamic, and then you climb up, right? And it becomes slow and stable. The types itself, right? You will have different types for different space. So if you take a look at the architecture, we talk about the North Star matrix, right? So that's very, very important to understand whether you are lining up your interests, your OKR to the higher ups. And we also have like implementations launch, right? For example, timeline launch, privacy documents launch. Privacy documents launch to make sure, right, that basically the feature that you have makes sense to the system design overall, right? It doesn't infringe any privacy, right? For example. And we also have like ideas. So it's about one-pager learning journeys, pre and post executions, evaluations, pre and post mortems. Right? So there are many different kinds of design docs that talks about different kinds of audiences, different kinds of types, and different kinds of objectives. Right? Okay. So this is the last part of my presentation, right? By the end of the day is that what are the principles of design docs, right? So I know that these are a lot of like words here. So I'm not, maybe like this is like if you want to know more, but let me try to visualize this, right, instead, because we all love visualizations more, right? And how we can use the previous charts as a way to sort of like utilize these principles. So the very first thing is that start from the ideas, right? So the ideas represent the one pager here. So I hope my cursor is there, right? So ultimately you will have a lot of more ideas, right? A lot of more like choices and alternative where you should dig upon, right? And whenever that you want to create a certain impact, you don't start with a very complex model first, right? You don't start with creating a systems in mind, but you actually invest more time in creating and writing out these ideas. So in one quarter, for example, I might have like 5 ideas that I'm working concurrently, right? That talks to a very different systems in different ideas, right? Or you can call it a bet, right? So this is another word for ideas. So once you invest time in a lower level space, what you want to do is that you want to prioritize, right? So which one pager that you want to prioritize? So for example, I look into this one pager, right? I experiment to it. For example, like implementing a certain feature. It doesn't look good, right? So if it doesn't look good, I hit a wall. Then usually what will happen is that I will move on, right? I will try to eliminate time sink. I will just move on, right? What's the next low hanging fruit so I can move on, right? So this is another one. So after that, maybe I realized that, hey, I don't have manpower to support it, right? Maybe the engineering team for this system is very, very important, very busy, right? So if that's the case, then maybe let's keep it up for next quarter or the following quarters, right? So that we can align our okay. So that's the idea, right? If that's the case, you don't have resources, then never mind. We move on to another one, right? So we always prioritize on the promising one pages, right? And afterwards, if we find a one pager that we can implement directly, and we can sort of like integrate it with our existing system, then we move on to the system design doc, right? To how we can actually integrate it, right? So that's where we talk about like prophecy design. That's where we talk about like a launch plan, right? That's where we talk about like launch pre-mortem, right? Which is very important, right? Because every launch we need to think about what's the worst case scenario. Hence the pre-mortem, right? So this is what's happening. And by the end of the day, if, which is quite rare, right? Especially for me, I still haven't like gone through the architectural design doc yet, which is quite rare. If let's say your system design doc is actually a huge improvement, it's a huge bet that we need to update the downstream and upstream applications, then it needs to go through the architectural design docs, right? And this talks about the whole unity of a certain systems. And this is where we talk about like, do we need to change the whole metrics, right? Does it make sense to look into reach and impressions? Do we also need to look into like, for example, like different users or churns of customers or whatever, right? So a certain improvement from the idea can actually lead to a metrics change based on my experience, right? And so it's always like from the down to up, but also it could go down again, right? So this is not one way, but it could also like go down again from design doc to another one pager and so on. So that's where we try to point directly to the golden nuggets and land into the North Star, right? Okay. So just a quick recap, and after that, maybe we can have a few minutes for Q&A, right? Is that the first one is that we have architectural space, right? And second, implementation space, and the third one is idea space, right? So all of these spaces are very important to know because this involves like different audience, right? You don't need to tell everything to your executive, for example, but you need to tell it to your maybe your direct manager or direct colleagues or direct cross team members. And by the end of the day, we also talk about top principles in design docs, especially to how we start from the bottom to go up slowly and slowly, right? And to make sure that we invest in the right directions and not just focus and fixated on one documentations that maybe like it's not ready to be implemented. Okay, so too long didn't read is that why design docs as a conceptual lighthouse, how to build design docs with objective, minimum viable products, etc. So research, milestones, and results. And after that, you have TLDR. Types of design docs will be from idea to implementation. So we talk about idea space, implementation space, and architectural space. Right. Okay. So if you're wondering like what's next, I also have like the next article about innovation in data projects. So all that you learned so far in the design docs, that would really, really help whenever you think about innovations in data projects. Because that's where you foster collaborations, and that's where you foster very great communications and documentations to remind yourself of what's important. So this is the end of my presentations. I hope this is like very useful for you, especially to enlarge your scope and your responsibility as a more senior data scientist, right? And feel free to reach out to me on Medium, LinkedIn. And if you find that I need to improve my presentations, you find that my presentation is very boring, or maybe like I think I've heard like better presentations than this, like way better, right? Feel free to like give me a survey because I would love to learn. This is the first time I talk about design docs to wider audience, right? So feel free to give me your response and feedback. And over back to you, Alexei.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. So I just want to remind everyone that there is a pinned link in the live chat that you can click and ask any question you want. And in the meantime, I have a few questions that I want to ask myself. So the first question is, like when we have a project, usually there are multiple iterations of the project. So first we do like some sort of proof of concept. This one pager, I think you mentioned that you just quickly iterate and see like if something is working or not. Then you have another iteration and then another iteration. So do you create a new design doc for each iteration, or you keep everything in one document?
That's a very good question. In hindsight, it's always better if you can actually keep in one design doc. But most of the time is that you don't know where to step next, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard to keep things in one design doc. So usually what happens is that the next design docs or the next idea is actually built on top of the previous design docs, right? So the iterative change, it will be a design docs change, right? So design docs about like, for example, feature engineering, design docs for integrations, and then design docs for launch plan, design docs for pre-mortem, post-mortem. It's always like built on top of like ideas design docs, right? And it's built in terms of importance as well, right? So usually what happens is that I would build the design docs iteratively. So it's not only one design doc for one project or one idea, maybe like 5 ideas, one bet, one bet, one idea, 5 design docs, right? So usually that's the case, right? But one thing that we need to understand here is that the idea for these design docs is that it's to establish a certain movement, right? A certain movement towards a milestone or certain result, right? Because by the end of the day, it needs to reach a North Star, right? What do we deliver for audience? What do we deliver for our customers? And if you want to build this into like, for example, one chain, usually what I do is that another doc, right? Another doc to solidify of like what are the design docs that we already have. So one centralized design doc, I always call it the design docs hub, right? Insert project name devs hub, right? So that actually puts like what are the upgrades and iterative projects that have been done towards a certain larger scope. Yeah, I hope that explains. Thanks. Great question, Alex.
Yeah, and you now were talking about this hub of design docs, and I could imagine already like a big document with many links. So how do you keep this organized? And we have a related question from Bayram. Is there any software for that? Because I imagine that maybe you need some sort of like, I don't know, wiki engine or Confluence to keep this organized, right? So how do you do this? Do you use some sort of software for that?
These are very good questions. There are softwares that help you to do that. In fact, a lot of people, colleagues that I know, they also like use like maybe like Evernote, or maybe like if you know like RAM notes, or maybe like we have also like for example PKM, personal knowledge management kind of like movement there, that sort of like tries to have a second brain kind of like movement. So we do have all the tools, and I think you know more than me maybe. But then for myself personally, what I do is just another design docs, right? So I always have like a master design docs to just like highlight, for example, what presentations I've made, what kind of directions that I've gone through. And for this design docs, right, it actually links to another design docs, which is another hub design docs for a lower scope. And then maybe it links to more ideas, right? So that's why at the very first beginning when I talk about objective, I actually create like Vincent project kind of thing, right? And that's actually have like design those okay projects that I'm working at, and then like what are the deliverables I'm working at. I also have scratch pads, right? So making sure that all like integrated into one like knowledge management to how I do that, right? Yeah, but again, it also very different because obviously I come from Google. I use like Google products. I need to use the Google products, right? And there are a lot of like PKM tools that might not fit like Google for Google employees to use. Or simply put, is that it's because like a lot of confidential information, right? So for my case, I just try to make it like very simple, pen and paper, and after that put it into a like centralized design docs. But if you want to experiment with Microsoft OneNote, Evernote, I think that works perfectly fine as well. So it really depends on what's available for you.
So basically you can start with Google Docs, right? And then just link different documents to each other.
Yeah, so it becomes like hierarchical tree, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. We have a question from Johan. So when are you ready to share your design docs to the audience, from the beginning or after a few iterations, a few personal iterations?
Okay. All right. Let me try to understand these questions. So basically, we are talking about the timing to present design docs, right?
Yeah, maybe
Oops.
this is
Oh, okay.
easier.
Thanks for sharing. This is easier. Yeah. So in this case, we are trying to identify the timing of the design docs when I'm sharing it. So I actually shared to that in terms of like my next article, like in terms of innovations, when I talk about like approvals, right, and when you should move on to the next iterations. But the ideal case of like when to share is that whenever you get stuck, right? Whenever you get stuck and you need approvals, for example. So in my case, for example, whenever I'm creating a feature, right? For example, let's say I have an idea to use a certain feature engineer to include into a certain model, right? So the idea that I want to take a look first is that how do I get resources, right? And what are the MVPs that I look into, right? So once I have the MVPs, I have the objective ready, and I sort of like have the resources and tools. Maybe one thing that I want to ask is that, hey, can we use this tool or not? Is it something the right directions that I want to go in or not, right? So whenever I get stuck, I always like ask maybe one person or two persons that are more senior or maybe relevant, right? For example, like they are in charge of certain subsystem that you don't know of, right? I will ask them that, can you help me take a look into these design docs and let me know if my direction is correct, right? So if that's the case, I call it the early review, right? This is the early review phase, right? So you don't really need approval for the early review first, but you just need to understand whether what you are proposing, is it like very crazy or is it something that's achievable? If it's achievable, then move on to the design docs, right? And afterwards, once you sort of have experiments that can deliver the MVP, minimum viable product, right? For example, I look into the ROC, AOC, and I can say that, oh, it improved like 30% recall without without any decrease of precision. This is hugely impactful, right? Then the next thing I want to say is that can we actually implement this into the system? Can we integrate it or can we launch it, right? And usually when I talk about this, right, then I need to have more approvals, right? Because to make sure that I get the supports, right? Are you going to support it? Are other people going to support it, right? Who's going to support it to make sense, right? I need to look into this, right? And I need to ask for their approvals. Do you think this can be an OKR or objective key results for the next quarter or next year, maybe? So that would be approval. And once I get the approval on these design docs, then I might go through another design docs, which is higher level. Or if I don't get approvals and it's kind of stuff, let's say they say, oh, manpower is not existing. Oh, this is a privacy set issues is so huge, right? Then I might move to another idea. I just give up, wait until the right timing to reactivate it and maybe move on to another idea. So usually that's what I do.
Mm-hmm. And just curious, how much time do you spend on writing a design doc? I guess it depends on a phase, like on a type of design doc, but in general, is it like 1 hour, 10 hour, 20 hours?
Usually if I want to write a design docs, right, of course it depends on the complexity, right? But usually it takes me maybe like 2 days until at the very least early review, right? Maybe like two times or three times edit, right? Because for the early review, we don't want to invest much time to it, right? We just want to sanity test, do you think the direction is correct? So it doesn't make sense to spend so much time before you get early review. But for the approvals, then it really depends, right? It really depends on whether your solutions is solid enough to prove the MVP, right? So the MVP, by right, it should be as concrete as possible. It should be as minimum as possible. So you can like push your design docs quickly, right? That's why it's called minimum viable product, right? So what's the minimum? So the idea is that you shouldn't waste too much time on one pager. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the question from Alex is, how does it fit the whole project lifecycle? So because there are frameworks like CRISP-ML, CRISP-DM, and other frameworks. So yeah, how does it fit into the whole picture, and would you use anything else to structure your work?
This is very insightful question as well. So thanks a lot. Is it you, Alex?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So to answer this, right? To answer this, of course, it's very fitting, but in which case of project lifecycle, right? So when we talk about project lifecycle, actually we talk about scrums. Usually we want to have a very fast-moving kind of like development, right? So we might have requirements, and then after that, requirements set up like some scenarios or some stories. Then after that, you want to implement it, right? And after that, you want to implement it, and then based on the implementations, then after that, you want to launch it directly, right? And then wait for another requirements, which is like very fast moving, right? So of course, we have used design docs for that as well, right? Because actually, it depends on the stage of the projects, and it also depends on the use cases of the projects. But most of the times, if you're talking about Google level, right, even like minimum changes, right, it's actually a huge impact to the reputation of Google, right? So let's say that if I introduce a feature that makes Google Pay hang, for example, right, it cannot work. Then obviously, right, if you don't have design docs, it's going to be very hard to debug, very hard to create postmortem, and very hard to fix it, right? So you can use scrums, but for the Google point of view, because like it's very high impacts, even like for minimum changes, right? Of course, reputations of Google is very huge in whatever like incremental changes that they have. Then scrums and design docs are very hand to hand together, right? In fact, it's very suggested and recommended in all layers of the design projects. In all layers, sorry, I don't make sense. in all layers of the projects that you have, right? And innovations that you have, including the idea stage, implementation stage, and architecture stage, right? Okay, I hope this is explaining.
Yeah, so for the slides, I think you will send the slides after the talk, right? And I already sent a link to the article about the design docs, and I think the samples are in the article, in the Medium article, right? So people can just go to the article and find the samples there. Am I correct?
Yep. Thank you for that, Alexei.
Yeah.
And I think we can move on to the last question.
Yep. So why are they called design docs? Do you know?
Yeah, I think what I've seen so far was specs or project requirements. What's the difference between these? That's a very good question. Honestly, I don't know as well why it's called design docs. It's just that we call it design docs in Google. Maybe in Amazon, or maybe, I don't know, maybe Alexis, you call it different. Do you call it differently, Alexis?
I think we just call them documents. I don't think we have any specific name for that.
Yeah, I should find a history of design docs. But yeah, I mean, design docs, the idea is not new, right? Even like you find it in the industrial engineering, or you talk about architecture, you talk about blueprint, right? So the idea of design docs is basically just a very general blueprint. And I think for different industry, I think they will call it differently, but in Google, they will call it design docs, right? And of course, the specs and project requirements, it could be a synonymous, right? Or it could be a type of design docs, honestly. It really depends on which, I think it really depends on which industry, which company. They will call it differently. But for Google point of view, which I think are quite followed by startups and other companies that I can think of, they use design docs quite unanimously, right? So I think that should help you. So the answer is that I don't know. I hope I can Google it, but I couldn't find it even in Google. So if you know the answer better than me,
It's also a bit confusing with design, you know, like design of web pages, for example. So maybe there is a little bit of confusion, like with user experience design, for example, when it's about layout, how things look like on the website.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I guess that's it. We don't have any other questions. I would like to thank you, Vincent, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. And I would like to thank everyone else for attending this event and asking questions. And yeah, don't forget to come on Friday. We will be talking about startups. Yeah, thanks, Vincent. And
Right.
have a great day, everyone. Bye.